Hi friends, my name is Cindy and I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And today we're going to do part 3 of our read aloud of The House with a Clock in Its Walls. And it's by John Bellairs and illustrated by Edward Gorey. Chapter 3. And here's a picture. On the first Monday after Labor Day, Louis started going to school in New Zebedee, and before long, he had forgotten all about the mysterious clock in the walls. He had troubles of his own. They weren't new troubles. They were the troubles of a fat boy who cannot play baseball, carries around with him from place to place. Louis had always been overweight. He couldn't remember a time when he hadn't been. All his life, all 10 years of it, he had been listening to children who chanted, "Fatty, fatty, 2x4, can't get through the kitchen door." Sometimes he wanted to beat up the kids who made fun of him, but he couldn't box, and he wasn't very strong. That was another problem. But the worst problem of all was the baseball problem. Louis still spun all the way around when he swung at a ball, and he threw his bat. At first he tried to excuse himself by saying, "Watch out, I'm going to throw the bat." But the other kids said, "Look, you throw the bat and we're going to beat you up. You hang on to it when you swing or you can't play." That is what they said when they let him play, which was not very often. Most of the time when he lined up to be chosen, he was the last one left, and the captain of the side that was supposed to take him usually said, "Why do we have to take him? He can't field, he can't hit, he can't pitch, he can't even run. Come on, we'll play one man short." What they said about Louis was true. Sometimes a new boy or a kind boy would get to be captain, and he would choose Louis for his team. But when Louis came to bat, he usually struck out. If he hit the ball, it popped up and the pitcher caught it. Or he might ground out to first base. When his team was out in the field, the boys made Louis play right field because not many balls got hit out that way. But when one did, Louis always dropped it unless it hit him on the head. He would stagger back and forth as he tried to keep track of the ball that hung there, high over his head. But he always got dizzy and covered his face with his glove and screamed, "No, no," as the ball came down. After a while, even the kind boys turned him down. One afternoon, when the usual routine had been gone through and Louis had run off the field sobbing because they would not let him play, he found himself standing at home plate on a baseball diamond that wasn't being used that day. At his feet was a bat, a thick old club with a split handle that had been wrapped up with black friction tape. There was a softball nearby, or what was left of one, a black, sticky, egg-shaped lump covered with string. Louis picked up the ball and bat. He threw the ball into the air and swung at it. He missed. He picked the ball up again and tried again. Again he missed. He was about to try for the third time when someone said, "You're doing it all wrong." Louis turned and saw a skinny boy about his own age squatting next to the bicycle rack. There was a big fluff of brick red hair on top of the boy's head, and his right arm was in a sling. The boy was Tarby. Everybody in the school knew who Tarby was. Even Louis knew, and he had only been in New Zebedee for a couple of months. Probably everyone in New Zebedee and most of the people in Capernaum County knew who Tarby was. At least that was the impression that Louis got. Tarby was the most popular boy in the school. He was a daredevil, the kind of boy who rode his bicycle through bonfires and hung by his knees from the limbs of trees. All the girls liked him, and he was the big home run hitter in the softball games. He got chosen first so often that most of the time the boys made him a captain just to avoid all the fighting over who got to have Tarby on their team. But here he was with his arm in a sling, watching Louis as he tried to hit the ball. "I said, you're doing it all wrong. You're supposed to keep your feet planted flat, then you swing from the hips. Here, let me show you." Tarby scrambled to his feet and walked over to where Louis was standing. He grabbed the bat and hefted it in one hand, choking up on it a bit. "Okay," he said, "get out there and pitch. Just lob it up here." Louis had never seen anyone try to hit the ball with the bat, held only in one hand. He was afraid that Tarby would miss and get mad and go home. With a nervous grin on his face, Louis lobbed the ball toward the plate. Tarby swung, and the bat connected. Clack! It struck the ball with that rickety hollow sound that split bats have. The ball shot on a line toward center field. It would have been a clean single. See, and that's just with one arm. You ought to be able to do that well with two. Come on, I'll pitch. Louis walked in from the pitcher's mound and took the bat from Tarby's hand. I didn't know your arm was broken, said Louis shyly. How'd you do it? Fell out of a tree. I was hanging by my knees, upside down, like in the monkey house. It's okay, it'll heal up. Tarby walked out to the mound. Louis pounded his bat on the plate and waved it the way he had seen George Kell do in Briggs Stadium in Detroit. But when Tarby threw the ball, Louis missed as usual. Every day for the next 2 weeks, Tarby met Louis after school, and they practiced batting. Slowly, gradually, Louis's swing got better. He even managed to hit a few line drives, but something even more important was happening. Louis and Tarby were getting to be friends. Tarby liked Louis's jokes, and Louis found out that Tarby hated some of the same kids that he hated. Louis liked Tarby's imitation of Mrs. Fondrider, a mean teacher at school. Mrs. Fondrider always called her husband Gerald, which was a funny thing to do. Tarby made a loop in the end of a green twig and pretended it was an eyeglass on a stick. Then he would stare through the loop at Louis and say in a high voice, "How dare you say such horrible things to me, Gerald?" Then Louis and Tarby would sit around planning how they were going to take care of Carol K. Laberdeen, a snotty girl in the 6th grade who got away with murder because her father was on the school board. It was usually dark by the time Tarby and Louis said goodbye to each other by the mailbox at the bottom of High Street. One afternoon, early in October, Louis and Tarby were out at the athletic field playing flies and grounders. Louis had gotten good enough so that he could hit Tarby some pretty long fly balls. Tarby's arm was still in a cast, but he picked off the line drives and caught the pop flies as easily as if he had 2 hands. Louis was out in the field. It was getting dark, and he was having trouble seeing the ball, and besides, he was a little bored. He stood there thinking, or doping off, as Tarby called it. He wanted to do something nice for Tarby, something nice that would impress him and make him a stronger friend than ever. Maybe he could get Uncle Jonathan to do a magic trick for Tarby. Sure, that would do it. Louis hesitated a minute, remembering Jonathan saying that he was only a parlor magician, the kind that pulled rabbits out of hats and told you what card you were holding in your hand. But then he had said that he knew a few tricks that went beyond that. Louis thought some more. Oh well, Jonathan could probably do it. Anyone who could make windows change their pictures could do what Louis had in mind. And anyway, Louis thought that he remembered hearing Jonathan say that he had done such a thing once. Hey, Louis, I hit the ball out to you about 6 hours ago. Did you fall asleep? Louis looked up. Huh? Oh, gee, I'm sorry, Tarby. Say, how would you like to see my uncle eclipse the moon? Tarby stared at him. What'd you say? I said, oh, come on, Tarby, let's go home. It's too dark to see the ball. Come on and I'll tell you all about my Uncle Jonathan. He's a real wizard. The 2 boys walked back under the streetlights, playing catch as they went. Louis tried to explain about Uncle Jonathan's magic powers, but he could see that Tarby was not convinced. Boy, I'll bet your uncle can eclipse the moon. I'll just bet he can. He probably sits up in his room drinking beer, and then he goes out back and stares up at the moon, and boy, does it go round and round. Tarby staggered out into the street and rolled his eyes. Louis felt like hitting him, but he knew that Tarby could beat him up, so he just said, You want to see him do it? Yeah, said Tarby in a sneery voice. I want to see him do it. Okay, said Louis. I'll ask him tonight. When he's ready to do it, I'll let you know. Gee, I hope I won't have to wait too long, said Tarby sarcastically. I really do want to see old Lardguts eclipse the moon. Stop it. Stop making fun of my uncle. Louis's face was red, and he was almost crying. "Make me," said Tarby. "I can't, and you know it," said Louis. Tarby went on moo-hooing until they reached the khaki-colored mailbox at the foot of High Street. This time, when they split up to go home, Louis didn't say goodbye to Tarby. He didn't even wave, but by the time he was inside the gate at 100 High Street, Louis had gotten over his mad, more or less, and so he went straight inside to see his uncle. He found Jonathan laying out a game of solitaire on the dining room table. It was a complicated game called Napoleon at St. Helena, and the layout covered most of the ivory-colored oilcloth pad. Jonathan looked up and smiled as Louis walked into the room. "Hi, Louis. How's baseball these days?" "Getting better, I guess. Tarby helps me a lot. Say, Uncle Jonathan, do you suppose we could do something nice for Tarby? He really is a good friend of mine." "Sure, Louis. We'll invite him to dinner. Is that what you mean?" Louis blushed and fidgeted. Well, yeah, kind of. Do you think that maybe after dinner we could, that is, you could eclipse the moon for him?" Jonathan stared at him. "Did I tell you I could do that?" "Yes, remember one night when you were talking to Mrs. Zimmerman about whether earth magic was stronger than moon magic? You said that a moon wizard could eclipse the moon any time he felt like it, and that you were a moon wizard." Jonathan smiled and shook his head. "Did I say that? My, how I do run on. Let me see. I do seem to recall eclipsing the moon one night in 1932. That was during a picnic out at Wilder Creek Park. I remember the date, April 30th, which is Walpurgis Night. That's the night when witches and warlocks all over the world get together for whoop-de-doos. Ours was just a convention of the Capernaum County Magicians Society, but some of them are real wizards. At any rate, to get back to what I was saying—" "Never mind," said Louis, turning away with a pouty look on his face. "I'll tell Tarby that you can't do it." "Oh, Louis," cried Jonathan, throwing the pack of cards down on the table, "you are the most easily discouraged boy I ever met. If I did it once, I can do it again. It's just that it's not a normal occurrence, and everything has to be just right. In the heavens, that is." "Oh." "Yes, oh. Now, as soon as I have won this silly game for myself, you and I will go to the library and consult the almanac. So be quiet for a minute." Louis fidgeted and clasped and unclasped his hands and stared at the light fixture until Jonathan finished his game. Then the two of them went to the library, slid back the paneled doors, and entered the marvelous room that smelled of damp paper, wood smoke, and Turcoman's Terror, Jonathan's personal tobacco blend. Jonathan moved the stepladder to the part of the wall that contained his magic books, climbed up, and pulled down a thick, dusty volume labeled Hardesty's Universal Omnium Gatherum, Perpetual Calendar, Datebook, Almanac, and Book of Days. He flipped to the section on eclipses, did some rapid mental calculations, and said, "You're in luck, Louis. 1948 is a good year for lunar eclipses. The planets will be favorable next Friday. Invite Tarby to dinner for that night. I'll be ready." Friday night came around, and Louis brought Tarby home for dinner. There was nothing especially magic about the meal, except that the cider jug on the table burped a lot, and that might have been because the cider was getting hard. After the dishes were cleared away, Jonathan asked Louis and Tarby to help Mrs. Zimmerman carry some kitchen chairs out into the backyard. Then he walked out into the front hall and consulted his cane rack, a blue willow-ware vase full of walking sticks of all sizes and shapes. Some had ivory or bone handles, some were tough, crooked old pieces of hickory or maple wood, and some had thin, springy swords concealed inside. But only one cane was magic. It was a long black rod of wood of some very hard wood. At one end was a ferrule of polished brass, and at the other was a glass globe the size of a baseball. It seemed to be snowing inside the globe. Through the swirling little flakes you could see, now and then, an odd little miniature castle. The globe burned with an icy gray light. Jonathan picked up the cane, hefted it, and walked back toward the kitchen with it tucked under his arm. Out in the backyard, the audience was ready. Mrs. Zimmerman, Louis, and Tarby sat in straight chairs facing the bird bath. It was a chilly, clear October night. All the stars were out, and a large, full moon was rising over the 4 elm trees at the far end of Jonathan's yard. The screen door slammed, and everyone looked up. The magician had arrived. Without saying a word, Jonathan went around to the north side of the house. An old mossy rain barrel stood there against the sandstone wall. Jonathan looked into the barrel, breathed 3 times on the dark water, and with his left forefinger cut the faintly shimmering surface into 4 quarters. Then he leaned low over the mouth of the barrel and began whispering in a strange language. The 3 spectators had not left their chairs. Jonathan had told them to stay where they were, but they craned their necks around a good deal, trying to figure out what the wizard was doing. The whispering, weirdly magnified by the mouth of the barrel, went on for some time. Louis twisted way around in his chair, but all he could see was the dark shape of Uncle Jonathan and the faintly glowing gray globe of the magic cane. Finally, Jonathan returned. In one hand, he held the cane, and in the other, he had a saucepan full of rainwater. "Is your uncle going to wash his hair?" whispered Tarby. "Oh, be quiet," hissed Louis. "He knows what he's doing. Just watch." Tarby, Louis, and Mrs. Zimmerman watched anxiously as Jonathan poured the saucepan into the bird bath. Then he went back to the rain barrel for more. Dip, splash. He came back with another panful. He emptied it and went back for a third. The third panful seemed to be enough. Jonathan set down the empty pan and picked up his cane, which had been leaning against the bird bath. The glass ball glowed and sent out a ray of dusty gray light. The ray rested on the surface of the water in the bird bath. Jonathan made signs over the water with the cane and started muttering again. "Come on and look," he said, motioning to the 3 spectators. They got up and walked over to the bird bath. The water in the flat, shallow concrete pan had started to heave and pitch, like ocean water in a storm. Louis was surprised to see tiny white caps forming. Then long rollers began to crash silently into the rim, sending pinpoint flecks of foam out onto the grass. Jonathan watched for a while along with the rest. Then suddenly he raised the cane and cried, "Peace! Peace to the waters of the earth! Show unto us the round disk of the moon, even as she now appeareth in the heavens above." The water calmed down. Soon it was a flat pool again, and floating on the still black surface was the cold reflection of the full moon. Now Jonathan did something very unlikely. As the others watched, he bent over and pulled a small boulder out of the pile of rocks at the base of the bird bath. Then, lifting it high in the air, he shouted, "Stand back!" and dropped the rock. Splash! Water slopped everywhere, and Louis did not get out of the way soon enough to keep from getting some on his shoes. When the water had calmed down again, Jonathan picked up the rock and looked into the pool. There, wobbly and creased with ripples, was the moon's reflection. "Still there?" said Jonathan, grinning. "Well, we'll just see about that." He reached down into the water and picked up the reflection. It might have been a trick, but the cold, ice-gray disk he held looked like the reflection that had floated in the pool a moment before. And sure enough, when Louis looked into the water, all he saw now was a shining blackness. Jonathan held up the reflection and turned it back and forth as if it were a dinner plate. The disk burned cold and bitter and sparkled like freshly fallen snow. It hurt Louis's eyes to stare at it for very long. Now Jonathan snapped his wrist and sent the disk flying across the yard. It sailed clear across to the dark thicket in front of the 4 elm trees. Then Jonathan, cane in hand, ran off after the disk. It was a long yard, and even in the moonlight, the boys and Mrs. Zimmerman could not see what he was doing down there. Suddenly, the air was filled with the inane glockling and blockling of bamboo wind chimes. There was a set of them hanging from one of the elm trees, and Jonathan had given it a good hard yank. Now he came dancing back up the yard, dueling with shadows and saying things like, "Ha! Have at you in your bladder for a blackguardly slacker! Hoo-ha! And the third in his bosom!" He stopped in front of the bird bath and held the ball of the cane up under his chin so that his face looked like an actor's face when it is lit from below by footlights. Slowly, he raised his right hand and pointed at the sky. "Look." And here he is. All three of the spectators looked up. At first, they saw nothing strange. Then, slowly, a black, tarry, drippy shadow oozed down over the face of the surprised moon. In no time at all, the moon was dark, completely dark, blacked out, without even the faint brownish umbra that marks its place during an ordinary eclipse. I'll show you the moon again up close. And the next time that we read, we will finish this chapter in part 4 and continue on. Thanks so much for stopping by again, friends. My name is Cindy, and I am one of the children's librarians in the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.